The morning light fell across my kitchen table, turning the steam from my teacup into ghostly ribbons. I opened my bank book like I always did on the first of the month. The balance should have been comfortable, enough for heating, a few garden repairs, and maybe the charity bake sale. But the number printed in black stopped my breath, £0. At first I thought it was a mistake, one of those digital slips the teller could fix with a smile. But my fingers trembled as I flipped the page and saw the single withdrawal line. The date was last week. The signature beneath it looked familiar, looped, uneven, like my own hand when tired. Except I hadn't been to the bank in a month. I traced the ink slowly, feeling my chest tighten. The clerk's stamp beside it confirmed it, processed in person. I stared until the letters blurred, then whispered, "No, that can't be right." When the kettle clicked off behind me, I nearly jumped. The house had never felt so loud. My late husband's photo on the mantel caught the morning glare. He looked calm, like he'd already guessed. The phone rang once before I answered, trying to keep my voice steady. "Good morning, Gran," came Ryan's bright tone. I almost smiled. "My boy, polite as always. Just wanted to thank you again for your gift. Lydia and I are finalizing honeymoon plans." Gift. The word hit like ice. "What gift, Ryan?" I asked quietly. He laughed. "Oh, come on, the transfer. Lydia said you insisted we take it as your blessing." I felt my pulse drum in my ears. My eyes returned to the empty line in the ledger, the shaky imitation of my signature. "Ryan," I said, gripping the receiver, "what exactly did you take?" Silence. Then a soft click as the call ended. The room seemed to shrink around me, and I understood. My savings were gone, and the thief carried my blood. The weekend before that call, I'd been baking lemon cake when Ryan and Lydia had appeared at my door, all smiles and flowers. Surprise visit. Lydia sang, her perfume filling the hall before she did. Ryan kissed my cheek and handed me tulips. "Just wanted to thank you for the wedding gift," he said. His eyes darted toward Lydia as if rehearsed. I remember frowning, confused. "Gift?" Lydia laughed, that high, perfect laugh. "Oh, Eleanor, you're too modest. Ryan said you insisted on helping with the honeymoon fund. You're truly an angel." She set the flowers in my old crystal vase without asking, then leaned across the counter, lowering her voice. "You'll be proud of what we do with it." At the time I only smiled weakly, assuming there'd been some misunderstanding. Ryan had always been thoughtful, sometimes careless, but never cruel. Lydia, though, she watched everything, even my hands as I poured tea. Before they left, she hugged me tightly, whispering, "Don't worry, we'll make every pound count." After they drove away, the scent of her perfume lingered, sweet and false. I stood in the empty kitchen, the tulips bright against the dull vase, and something inside me unsettled. Now, days later, that visit replayed in my head like a film loop I couldn't stop. Every wink, every word sounded sharper, rehearsed. I sat on the edge of my bed that night holding the phone, wanting to call Ryan, to demand the truth, yet afraid of what I might hear. My husband's photo caught my eye again. "George," I whispered, "what would you have done?" The silence answered for him. He'd served in the war, fought for honesty and pride. He'd have demanded proof. I decided then, tomorrow I'd go to the bank. And if what I feared was true, I would not weep, I would count. The bank smelled of paper and disinfectant. The young clerk smiled politely when I slid the withdrawal slip across the counter. "Could you tell me who processed this?" She checked her screen, her fingers tapping fast. "Yes, Mrs. Moore, that was done at our central branch by you." "By me?" My voice cracked. She turned the monitor so I could see the scanned authorization. My own name in wobbly ink. Below it, a crude copy of my initials. I felt my stomach twist. "Could I have a copy?" I asked quietly. She hesitated, then nodded, printing it and sliding it discreetly into an envelope. "Sometimes family members mean well," she offered gently. I gave a thin smile. Sometimes they mean well for themselves. Outside, the cold air felt cleaner than the bank's false warmth. I walked slowly through town, clutching the envelope like it might burn through my coat. Each step home grew heavier. At my gate, I paused, staring at the garden George had planted, daffodils pushing through soil despite frost. Stubborn things. I liked that about them. Inside, I spread the documents on the table. The ink shimmered faintly. The handwriting wasn't perfect, but close enough to fool any teller. The date matched the day of their surprise visit. My jaw tightened. For a long time I sat staring at the papers until my tea went cold. The ticking clock grew loud, too loud. I folded the page, slid it back into the envelope, and tucked it inside my knitting basket. Somewhere safe, somewhere patient. Tomorrow, I would call Ryan. Not to plead, but to listen. When trust breaks, the sound is quieter than glass. You only notice after it cuts you. I dialed his number before dawn, the sky still grey. He answered groggily, "Gran? Everything okay?" "Ryan," I said evenly. I looked at my account. A pause. Then the sound of him sitting up. "Listen, it's not what you think." "What do I think exactly?" He hesitated. I could hear Lydia's voice in the background, low and sharp. Then laughter, hers. "It was just a loan," he said quickly. "We were short before the wedding. We'll pay you back after the honeymoon." The calmness in his voice didn't match the tremor in mine. "A loan requires asking, Ryan." "Gran, you've got plenty saved. We'll return it, I promise." Lydia's laugh pierced again, closer this time. "Tell her we'll send postcards from paradise," she said, mocking. My throat tightened. "You'll send nothing if you don't pay it back before you fly," I said, my words slow, deliberate. "Gran," but I had already hung up. For minutes I stood holding the receiver, listening to the empty dial tone hum like a warning. My hands shook, not from age but from fury contained too long. I poured myself another cup of tea, added no sugar, and stared out the window. The world outside moved normally. Milk truck passing, postman waving. Yet mine had shifted irreversibly. I whispered to the empty air, "They think kindness is weakness." Then I smiled, a thin, unfamiliar curve. They would learn otherwise. Please subscribe, like and share for more, thanks. The rehearsal dinner took place at a rented hall buzzing with laughter and champagne. I wore George's pearl brooch, a quiet armor. When I entered, Ryan looked relieved, maybe ashamed. Lydia, radiant in gold, swept across the room to kiss my cheek. "You made it," she sang. I smiled politely. Wouldn't miss it. Through the meal, relatives toasted their bright future. I sipped water and listened. Lydia bragged about their honeymoon, private villa, ocean view, staff trained for royalty. Someone asked how they managed such expense. She winked at me. "We had a little help from family. Royalty always travels first class." I raised my glass. "Royalty," I said evenly, "always pays in gold." Ryan's fork froze midair. Lydia laughed too loudly. The table shifted uncomfortably, sensing an undercurrent no one dared name. Later, as music swelled, I excused myself to the powder room. I locked the door, opened my purse, and unfolded the copied withdrawal slip once more. Under the harsh light, the false signature looked uglier than before. My reflection met mine in the mirror. "You've raised him better," I whispered. "So teach him better." When I returned, I kissed Ryan's cheek goodnight. "Enjoy your evening, dear. The next sunrise may look different." He frowned but said nothing. Back home, I placed the slip in the small safe beside George's war medals. Only when I opened it did I realize half the contents were missing. Deeds, certificates, a few heirloom coins. At the back of the safe lay a folded note in Lydia's handwriting. "We'll make it up to you." The world tilted slightly. I sat down hard, clutching the empty envelope. The fire crackled behind me, waiting. So this, I thought, is how betrayal feels when it wears perfume. The lawyer, Mr. Dawson, came by the very next morning looking like someone who had been up half the night with papers. He smelled of old books and tobacco, and his hands trembled a little when he set his satchel on my kitchen table. I showed him the copy the bank clerk had given me. He adjusted his glasses and read the scanned authorization slowly, like a man reading a verdict he did not want to deliver. "You kept this?" he asked. I nodded. "Good." He sat back and folded his hands. This is not a small thing, Eleanor. Forged signatures on a transfer, that's criminal. I watched the color leave his face when I told him about Ryan and Lydia's visit. He tapped the paper. The date lines up with their trip booking. If Ryan signed that, he signed his own undoing. He looked at me for a long time, eyes soft. You want me to trace the money? Yes, I said quietly. I want to know every pound that left this house. He smiled then, but it was not pity, it was the look of a man who liked puzzles. I'll need a list of accounts, any vetting papers, anything. I can get investigators on this without naming you at first. We'll move quietly. I thought of the safe and the note in Lydia's handwriting. And if they deny it? I asked. Dawson's fingers tapped the table. Then we make sure the law hears their denial. He leaned in. Sometimes families take what they think is help and call it love. Sometimes they call it theft. We'll find out which it is. Relief came like a careful tide. Not the shout of triumph, but the slow untying of a knot in my chest. I had planned to get angry, to shout, to make scenes. Instead, a calculated calm settled. I would not be the woman who broke into sobs and let the world bandage her. I would be the woman who counted and reclaimed. Dawson rose, gathering his satchel. I'll start on tracing transfers. You stay quiet. Don't confront them again. I nodded, and when he left, I stood at the window watching his car disappear. The garden looked small and steady. I made tea and set the kettle down gently, feeling the first true plan forming in my mind. I sat with my old photo albums that afternoon, turning pages slowly as if each picture might hold a clue. There was Ryan as a toddler, barefoot and sticky with jam, grinning up at me with all the trust a child could hold. There were years of Christmases and birthdays, the same hands I had once used to tie shoelaces and mend shirts. Lydia appeared later in the albums, first at a barbecue, then more often, always polished and measured in her smiles. One picture stopped me cold, Lydia at my 70th birthday, leaning over the cake with her hand resting on Ryan's shoulder. Her eyes met the camera square and cold, like she saw more than the moment. I traced that face with my thumb and felt the old anger rise up again. It was a small thing, just a photograph, but it showed me timing and intent. She had always known how to look at the right moment. I called Mrs. Finch next door. Do you remember anything odd around the time they visited? I asked. Her voice was hushed. Oh, Eleanor, she said, they came at odd hours. Lydia always watching receipts and writing lists in a small notebook. The notebook, an image of it nested in my mind like a seed. I began to map the days, Lydia's arrival with the tulips, the bank withdrawal days, the wedding bookings. The pieces started to fit like an old jigsaw. I made a list on a scrap of paper and pinned it with a needle to my pinboard. Visit date. Transfer date. Hotel booked. Underneath I wrote one word, pattern. That evening I took the list to Dawson. He smiled grimly and called an old acquaintance from the bank to lift more details. She's systematic, he said after a call. This looks less like desperation and more like planning. I slept poorly that night with the album on my chest. I dreamed not of the money but of the small ways trust had been pocketed every day, helping with breakfasts, lending a shirt, fixing a flat tire, each kindness folded into a history that could be used. In the morning I woke with a new resolve. I would not only prove the theft, I would show the pattern that made it possible. That little notebook of Lydia's, if I could find it, might be a map of everything she had planned. I dusted the house that afternoon with a sharper eye than usual, looking for the small things that people leave behind. A scuff on the hallway skirting, a lipstick mark on a wine glass, evidence of living. I found a thin receipt tucked between the cushions of my old armchair when I moved them to fluff the upholstery. It was from a travel agency, dated 2 weeks before their visit, printed with Lydia's name and a booking reference. My fingers went numb as I read it. I called Dawson immediately. I have something, I told him, and he came over within the hour. He held the receipt like a man reading dispatches. This means they were planning, before they came to your house. He tapped the paper. This is useful. We worked quietly for the rest of the day. Dawson called in a favor at the council and they put a freeze on any recent attempted sales linked to my name. I moved restlessly through the rooms, every photograph seeming suddenly heavy with meaning. I thought about the safe and the missing medals and deeds. The house felt like a stage and I was watching a replay of a play I'd only half understood. Mrs. Finch brought over lemon cake that evening and sat with me while we sipped tea. She shook her head slowly. Little Lydia, she said, always looked like she was measuring people, not listening to them. Her words cut like small scissors. That night, I laid out all the papers on the dining table and wrote notes in the margins, connecting dates to events with a pen. I felt oddly young, the way I had when George and I first planned the house, chalking measurements and counting bricks. This was different work but similar muscles, planning, patience, and attention to small detail. Before bed I walked into the garden and touched the roses George loved. The air smelled like earth. I whispered to him, "I'm not done yet." The resolve settled into me like a warm cloak. I would follow every thread until Lydia's notebook had no more secrets. My retired accountant instincts woke up with a new vigor. I dug out my old ledger from the cupboard, a book I had not opened in years, and sat with a pencil and Dawson's notes. For hours I listed every regular bill, every insurance policy, and every small income one could remember. The numbers lined up like soldiers on a parade ground. My hand did not shake as it had on the morning I first saw the empty balance. It was steady and precise. Dawson had arranged for a clerk he trusted to pull more statements. When the envelope arrived, I opened it with a careful hand. Line by line, I compared what I had believed with what the records showed. Small withdrawals here, a transfer there, gaps where money had been claimed for services that never were. With each line I felt less like a victim and more like someone regaining a map of her own life. "Look here," Dawson said, pointing to a transfer labeled gift. It matched the day the receipt had been printed. Labeling it a gift was clever. It tries to wriggle out of legal scrutiny. I closed my lips and circled it. But a forged signature makes it theft. I felt a dark satisfaction as I ticked off each amount and assigned it a date and a name. I wrote careful notes for the investigator Dawson would hire. Each note felt like a step toward balance, toward a ledger that told the truth. That night I took the ledger to bed and read it like scripture, each summer prayer. I thought of George's hands, worn and honest, and felt a warmth rise in me, part sorrow, part stubbornness. I would rebuild what had been taken, not for pride but to set right the small fairness of an ordinary life. By dawn my list was long and my heart was light with purpose. I had a plan, and plans are the first tool of people who refuse to be victims. The neighborhood had always been a small web of gossip and knitted curtains. In the days that followed, whispers came to my ears like stray bees. Mrs. Finch hinted at Lydia's family stories. A postman mentioned Lydia's expensive taste. A barista at the market said she'd seen Lydia discussing prices with a sharpness that made the shopkeeper flinch. Each rumor was a small tile in a mosaic that was beginning to show a pattern I did not like. One morning I heard Mrs. Finch mutter something about Lydia's other marriages. 3 men, sudden moves, quick sales. My hands trembled but not with fear, with the recognition of a pattern, a woman who took and left. I went home with that whisper lodged in my pocket and pulled out the old phone book. I called Dawson and asked him to check for any connections Lydia's name might have in other towns. He called back within the hour. "There's a name," he said. "Same surname, 2 towns away. Patterns repeat." That afternoon I visited the local registry and quietly asked for copies of documents related to the deed to my house. I found the clerk I had once tutored years ago and she smiled and nodded when I explained, slipping me a photocopy under the table. I compared the signatures and found small similarities, an arched flourish, a thin line. Her fingers felt smaller now as I traced the forged loops. I felt something like pity for Lydia, a woman shaped by choices that hardened into habit. But pity would not reclaim my money. So I turned it into fuel. I told Dawson about the names and he filed them away in the case file. "If Mrs. Finch's gossip is true, then the pattern will show in records," he said, and I nodded. Walking back home, I passed the bakery and watched the baker knead dough, patient, repetitive, making something useful. I thought of my own patient work. Each action I took was another fold in a long recipe that would end in something I liked more than revenge: restoration. The next morning I woke with a strange calm, the kind that comes when fear turns into focus. I cleared the dining table and opened the old ledger again, laying out Dawson's documents beside it. My pencil moved fast. Every missing pound had a story, and I was ready to write it down. Electric bill. Insurance premium. Savings account interest. Gone, one by one. But now I saw the pattern clearly: Lydia's fingerprints everywhere. The travel receipts, luxury store payments, jewelry deposits, all in the weeks before the wedding. I wrote each name in neat, firm letters. My pen didn't shake this time. It felt like something had returned to me: control. I was no longer the frightened grandmother holding an empty bank book. I was an accountant again, the woman who once balanced company ledgers to the last penny. Dawson arrived at noon, carrying sandwiches. He looked over my notes and whistled. "You've done half the detective's work yourself." "Old habits," I said, sipping tea. "Numbers always confess if you listen long enough." He smiled. "Then listen to this. Ryan and Lydia opened a joint account 2 weeks before your funds vanished." I leaned back slowly. 2 weeks, I repeated. She planned this before they ever knocked on my door. "Yes," Dawson said. "And that joint account? It's now empty too." For a moment, I almost pitied my grandson. He thought he'd married luck. He'd only joined a pattern of ruin. That night I stared at the blank wall above the fireplace, imagining how George would have handled it. He'd have gone straight for confrontation. But I had learned that quiet action could cut deeper than words. I closed the ledger and whispered to his picture, "You built with strength. I'll rebuild with precision." The house creaked softly in approval. Mrs. Finch came by the next morning with her usual curiosity wrapped in kindness. "Heard from your Ryan lately?" she asked as she poured milk into her tea. "Not since his confession," I replied evenly. She pursed her lips. "Poor lad. That wife of his, though, there's talk about her family. Did you know her uncle lost 3 men's savings before disappearing abroad?" My eyebrows rose. 3. She nodded eagerly. 2 investors, 1 suitor. The girl's mother was the same, married rich, left richer. The teacup in my hand rattled softly against the saucer. Gossip could be unreliable, but sometimes truth hid inside whispers. After she left, I sat by the window thinking. If Lydia's family had done this before, then she was predictable, and predictability was a weakness I could use. I called Dawson immediately. "Can you check her maiden name against fraud records?" He returned my call 2 hours later. "Nothing concrete, but there's a pattern: settlements, fast property sales, new towns." I smiled faintly. Then she's not creative, just practiced. That evening, I walked to my husband's study, dusted the old desk, and pulled out his journal. Inside were notes on wartime strategies: small acts, big impact. "Never fight rage with rage," he'd written once. "Fight with logic. It lasts longer." I traced the line with my fingertip and nodded. Lydia wanted to play a game of gain. I would play one of endurance. Outside, the neighborhood lights flickered on, one by one. The world looked peaceful, but I knew the undercurrent was shifting. The thief thought she'd left no trace, but she'd walked right into the oldest trap there was, her own pattern. I leaned back and whispered, "Predictable people are the easiest to surprise." The following morning, I phoned the bank again. The young clerk recognized my voice immediately. "Mrs. Moore, how may I help?" "I want to freeze the rest of my estate," I said calmly. "And I'd like my property deeds moved into a trust." "Of course, ma'am. For what purpose?" "For safety." The paperwork was tedious, but precision had always been my refuge. I signed every line with a steady hand, transferring the last of my remaining funds into a controlled account that Lydia couldn't touch. I added strict instructions: if anyone tries to sell my house, call the police first. Dawson dropped by later with a grin. "You've officially built a fortress, Eleanor." "Good," I replied. "Now I can plan from behind the walls." That night, I sat on the porch with tea, watching the moonlight spill across the roses George had planted. I thought of Ryan, not with hate, but with tired sorrow. He'd been kind once. But love without discernment becomes weakness, and Lydia had weaponized his. I began writing letters, one to my bank, one to Dawson's firm, one to my solicitor. They contained simple instructions for what would come next. If I was going to act, I would do it methodically. Before bed, I looked again at the note Lydia had left in my empty safe. "We'll make it up to you." I folded it neatly, placed it inside my ledger, and wrote beside it in pen, "I will make it up to myself." The next step was trickier. Lydia's weakness was greed, Ryan's was loyalty. I needed both. So I visited an old friend of George's, Mr. Hollis, once an insurance manager, now a retiree with too much time and a sharp mind. He welcomed me warmly. "Eleanor Moore," he said, shaking my hand. "Haven't seen you since George's service." "I'm here for advice," I said. "Travel insurance." He raised a brow. "You planning a trip?" "Not me. Someone else." Over tea, I explained just enough. Not names, only circumstances. Say a couple purchased an expensive honeymoon package under false funds. How might one cancel paradise? He chuckled. "You'd need to trace the booking, airline, insurer, agency. If the payment source is disputed or under investigation, the whole package suspends automatically." My heart beat faster. And if one were to notify the insurer quietly? He smiled. Then paradise might close its gates without a sound. When I left his house, the wind felt sharper, charged. I knew exactly what I needed to do. That night, I called Dawson. "We'll need to verify their travel details." He didn't ask why. "Already in motion," he said. As I hung up, I looked toward George's photograph on the mantel. "They wanted a honeymoon," I murmured. "I'll give them one to remember." The house seemed to hum with agreement. Days before the wedding, I learned from Dawson that Lydia had secretly filed a prenuptial agreement. The document protected her if Ryan lost everything. That alone told me what she expected. "She's planning his downfall too," Dawson said grimly. I nodded. "Then I'll write her a different ending." Through a clerk I'd once tutored at the courthouse, I obtained a copy of the prenup. Its cold legal lines favored Lydia completely. But all forms had mirrors, and I had learned to draft one. That evening, I sat at George's old desk, lit a lamp, and began writing. The new document matched the original in every font and clause, except for one, a single addition stating that in the event of fraud or misrepresentation, Lydia's claim to assets would be null and void. It was precise, elegant, and devastating. I sealed it in an envelope and dripped wax over the flap, pressing George's old signet ring into it. A perfect match. When I finished, I sat back and whispered, "Forgery can serve truth, just this once." Dawson reviewed it the next day and chuckled softly. "You're brilliant, Eleanor." "No," I said, folding the paper. "I'm simply done being naive." Outside, wedding bells began to ring faintly from a nearby church. I smiled. Let them enjoy their vows. Tomorrow, I'll enjoy justice. The wedding day dawned too bright for the kind of ceremony it was. The sky was blue, the air warm, the world far too kind for deceit. I dressed carefully in navy silk, pinned George's brooch to my collar, and carried my handbag close. Inside it, folded neatly, was my forged mirror document. At the reception, the chatter was endless: flowers, lace, champagne. Lydia floated among guests like a queen certain of her crown. Ryan looked nervous, tugging at his tie every few minutes. When they came to greet me, Lydia smiled with practiced sweetness. "Eleanor," she said, "we're so happy you came. You've been so generous." I held her gaze. "You'll find I'm generous in unusual ways." Before they left for the honeymoon, I pulled Ryan into a quiet corner. "Here," I said, handing him a white envelope. "A farewell gift, travel vouchers." He hesitated. "Gran, you didn't have to." "I wanted to," I said simply. "Spend them well." The envelope contained nothing more than printed details of their travel insurance. Details that, once activated, would lead straight to Hollis's department for verification. In hours, paradise would begin to tremble. As Lydia hugged me goodbye, her perfume clung to my sleeve. "I always knew you'd come through," she whispered. I smiled faintly. So did I. That night, I sat alone by the fire, the wax seal of the mirror prenup resting on the table. Outside, the moon rose pale and steady. I said to George's picture, "They've taken enough. Now I take back." It wasn't rage anymore. It was arithmetic, one wrong cancelled by another, neat and complete. Tomorrow, they would board their plane. And by the time they landed, paradise would already be under audit. I woke early the next morning, nerves taut like piano strings. I sat by the window with tea, watching the sunrise touch the garden roses gold. The sound of distant bells carried from the churchyard, a Sunday morning illusion of peace. Dawson called around 10. "They've boarded," he said. "Flight confirmed." "Good," I replied, setting my teacup down. "Then we start." He had already contacted Hollis, who would quietly flag their travel policy as pending verification. The moment the hotel attempted to charge their stay, everything would freeze. Still, I needed proof that Lydia's fraud ran deeper. Dawson's clerk sent word that the fake prenup had been registered, thanks to a small favor owed. It was filed right beside Lydia's original, indistinguishable in form. The precision pleased me. By evening, I took a slow walk through the village. Everyone talked about the wedding, how beautiful the bride was, how proud I must be. I smiled politely, saying little. As I reached my gate, Mrs. Finch called out from across the street, "Eleanor. They're off to the islands, I hear." "So I've heard," I answered softly. Inside, the house felt almost too quiet. I poured a glass of sherry and sat by the fire, imagining them laughing on the plane, clinking glasses of champagne, thinking they'd won. But deceit always forgets its receipt. I closed my eyes, hearing George's voice in memory, "Revenge is easy, Ellie. Justice takes skill." I whispered, "Then let's be skillful." The clock struck midnight. Somewhere above the clouds, their future had just entered turbulence. By the time the sun rose on their arrival, I had already set the final domino upright. Dawson called at breakfast. "It's done. Their accounts under review. The hotel's payment flagged." I stirred my tea slowly. "Then we wait." The phone rang again that afternoon. Unknown number. I knew before answering. Ryan's voice, tight and panicked, filled the line. "Gran, they're saying our cards declined. The bank froze everything." I let a pause stretch long enough to sting. "Banks dislike stolen signatures, Ryan." "What? What are you talking about?" "Ask your wife," I said quietly, and hung up before he could reply. The satisfaction wasn't gloating. It was silence reclaimed, my silence, finally heavier than theirs. An hour later, Dawson sent a message, email intercepted from Lydia's account. Subject, "Prenup revised, by your mother-in-law." I pictured her in some luxury suite, face pale as the attachments opened, her own fake signature staring back at her in perfect reflection. I almost laughed. By nightfall, I lit a fire, the flames bright and calm. I thought of George again, how he'd once said, "When wrongdoers panic, let them. It's the sound of the world balancing its books." Outside, the wind picked up, carrying faint echoes from the church bells across the valley. I raised my glass toward the photograph above the mantel. "Bon voyage," I murmured. "To the truth." Morning came with the hum of distant news. Dawson phoned again. "It's unfolding faster than expected. The hotel contacted authorities, suspected payment fraud." "Excellent," I said softly. He chuckled. "You're colder than most lawyers I know." "Not cold," I corrected. "Just finished." That afternoon, a courier arrived with an envelope addressed in Lydia's handwriting, forwarded through my solicitor. Inside were documents seized from her suite, their travel vouchers, my farewell gift, and a printed letter from the insurer confirming cancellation. I smiled faintly. Later that evening, another message arrived, this time from the hotel manager himself, requesting verification of the travel voucher source. I responded with a single line, "Funds under investigation, refer to legal counsel." Somewhere across the sea, I imagined Lydia arguing with reception staff, Ryan pleading, both unraveling. Dawson came by that night with a newspaper draft he'd intercepted, "Newlyweds Face Fraud Probe on Luxury Honeymoon." The headline alone was enough. I folded it neatly. "Keep it quiet for now," I said. As we sat with tea, he looked at me carefully. "You don't seem happy." "Justice isn't happy," I replied. "It's balanced." When he left, I went to the porch. The wind was cool, the garden still. I looked at the dark windows of my house and felt something like peace. The game was moving without me now. By morning, the world would begin whispering their story the way it once whispered mine. Only this time, the right names would carry the shame. At dawn, I woke to the sound of the phone ringing. It was Ryan again. His voice cracked. "Gran, please, Lydia's furious. They say our reservation's invalid, the police came, what's happening?" "Consequences," I said simply. "Please," he begged. "We didn't mean." "You didn't mean to get caught," I corrected. He started to protest, but I ended the call. My hands were steady. Later, Dawson called. "It's official. Their honeymoon package has been revoked. Travel fraud inquiry initiated. The embassies alerted." I smiled, though it felt like relief, not triumph. Good. Let them answer questions for once. By afternoon, I sat in the garden, trimming George's roses. The scissors clicked softly, rhythmic, cleansing. The phone buzzed again, this time a news alert: young couple under investigation for misuse of pension funds. Pension funds. My funds. The symmetry almost made me laugh. That night, I made tea, extra sugar, and toasted softly to the empty chair across the table. "They wanted a fairy tale," I said. I gave them one. Just not the kind they expected. I slept deeply, dreamless, for the first time in weeks. In the morning, the post arrived. A letter from Dawson sat on top, confirmation that the funds had been traced, ready for legal return to my trust. I placed it on the mantel, beside George's picture. The fire crackled gently, steady as my heartbeat. For the first time, the silence in the house didn't ache. It simply existed, peaceful, purposeful, mine. The next morning, I found a new email waiting in my inbox. The sender's name was blocked, but the subject line read, "Prenup revised by your mother-in-law." It had been forwarded from Lydia's address through a secure trail. Dawson set to monitor the situation. He called minutes later, voice amused. "She's opened it." "What did she see?" I asked. "Two attachments, the real prenup and your mirror version. She's probably still figuring out which one the court will believe." I imagined Lydia's painted smile collapsing as she realized her safety net was nothing but paper. My tea tasted sweeter that morning. Ryan called soon after. His tone was frantic. "Gran, something's wrong. Lydia's crying, saying you've ruined her. What did you do?" "Nothing," I said. "I just corrected a few signatures." He tried to speak, but I ended the call. I had no desire to calm the storm that honesty had summoned. Later that day, Dawson confirmed that the bank had initiated fraud proceedings. Lydia's assets were frozen pending review. I walked to the garden and sat among George's roses. The sunlight caught on their thorns, beautiful and sharp. "She wanted luxury," I whispered. "Now she'll get clarity." The wind carried the faint sound of church bells, distant and slow. I closed my eyes, remembering George's words again, "Never shout for justice. Whisper, and let the world lean in to listen." That night, I slept with the windows open, the cool air filling the room. Somewhere, in a luxury suite thousands of miles away, the first true silence of their marriage had begun, and I had given it to them. By midweek, the newspapers had picked up the story. The headline read, "Newlyweds Honeymoon Halted Amid Banking Investigation." The photo showed Lydia shielding her face from cameras while Ryan stood beside her, pale and shaken. I folded the paper neatly, letting the ink dry against my fingertips. Dawson came by for tea. "They'll be questioned abroad," he said. The hotel filed a formal complaint for payment fraud. I nodded. "Let them answer their own math." He smiled faintly. "You're remarkably calm, Eleanor." Calm, I said, is what guilt can't shake. That evening, a courier arrived at my door. The envelope was thick, sealed with red wax. My name written in Lydia's sweeping script. I broke it open carefully. Inside was a single photograph of 2 documents, the original prenup and my forged twin, laid side by side. Below them, a note in elegant cursive. Who do you think they'll believe? I laughed quietly. The one who tells the truth twice, I murmured. Attached was another letter, unsigned but unmistakably hers. You'll regret crossing me. I placed both pages in my ledger beside the forged withdrawal slip, closing the cover gently. Later that night, Dawson called again. You might receive a few legal threats from her camp. Ignore them. Oh, I plan to, I said. The house creaked with the sound of rain against the windows. I poured another cup of tea, added a drop of honey, and whispered, rain always finds its way through cracks. So does justice. The thunder rolled softly in response. I didn't flinch. The following morning brought chaos overseas. Dawson rang me before breakfast. The hotel manager just called, he said, half laughing. Lydia accused them of conspiracy. And what did they say? They called the embassy. The details trickled in throughout the day. Lydia had screamed at the staff, demanded free accommodation, then fainted when the authorities arrived. Ryan tried to calm her, but ended up being questioned too. Their passports were temporarily held while the investigation continued. I listened quietly, feeling neither joy nor pity. It was the symmetry that pleased me, the equal weight of action and result. In the afternoon, I walked into town for groceries. People greeted me kindly, some mentioned the headlines. I smiled and said little. The best revenge stories are the ones no one believes you capable of writing. When I returned home, I found another letter waiting in the post. It bore no name, only a faint perfume. Inside was a photograph of Lydia standing alone at the airport, bags in hand, expression furious and broken. Beneath it, a single line in Ryan's handwriting, she's gone. I sat for a long time at the table, staring at that note. My heart ached, not from loss, but from the echo of recognition. Greed always leaves the greedy alone. That night, I wrote a short reply I never sent, then come home, Ryan. There's still truth left to face. I placed it under George's photograph. He looked proud even in stillness, as if he'd been expecting this moment all along. Outside, the rain had stopped. The air smelled like something clean, something starting over. The next day's call came earlier than expected. Dawson's tone was firm but satisfied. Eleanor, you'll want to sit for this. All funds reverted to your trust this morning. For a moment, I couldn't speak. Completely. Every pound, he confirmed. The bank ruled in your favor. The signatures were officially deemed fraudulent. I let out a slow breath. And Lydia? He sighed. Her accounts are frozen. The investigation continues. I looked around my kitchen. Quiet, warm, safe again. Then the math is even. When I hung up, I made a fresh pot of tea and sat by the window, watching light spill across George's roses. Balance restored. Later that afternoon, the doorbell rang. It was the postman with another envelope. This time, the handwriting was Ryan's. Inside was a single sheet of paper. Gran, I didn't know she'd do this. Please believe me. I'll fix it. I stared at his words, simple and desperate. He sounded like the boy who used to bring me daffodils from the garden. But this wasn't a daffodil problem. It was a root one. I folded the letter and tucked it beside Lydia's note. You both wrote apologies, I said aloud. Only one of you will mean it. As evening fell, I stepped outside. The wind was cool, the first stars just beginning to appear. The roses swayed in rhythm. I whispered, George, we've done it. Not with fists, but with ink. For the first time in months, I felt light. Justice didn't always need celebration. Sometimes it only needed peace. Ryan returned home a week later, thinner, sunburned, and carrying a suitcase that looked far too empty. The neighbors watched from behind curtains as his taxi rolled away. He stood at the edge of my garden for a long time before walking up the path. I waited on the porch, 2 cups of tea already cooling on the table. He looked older, eyes hollow. "Gran," he said softly, "I messed everything up." I studied him carefully. "Yes," I replied. "You did." He swallowed hard. "I didn't mean for it to go that far." Lydia said many things, I interrupted. "You chose to believe them." He lowered his head. "I'm sorry." I nodded toward the chair opposite mine. "Sit. Tea's getting cold." He obeyed, hands shaking slightly as he reached for the cup. For a while, neither of us spoke. Only the sound of birds filled the air. Finally, I said, "Tell me what you learned." He hesitated. "That money can make you forget who you are." I nodded. "And who reminded you?" He looked up, eyes wet. "You did." We sat quietly after that, the weight of unspoken things between us. When he left that evening, I didn't promise forgiveness. But I didn't close the door either. Inside, I looked at George's photograph again and murmured, "He's learning the hard way, but at least he's learning." The kettle began to whistle, steady and soft. I smiled faintly. "Lesson 1," I whispered, "never steal from a woman who taught you to count." A few days after Ryan's return, Dawson came by with new documents. He laid them out neatly on the kitchen table, the smell of old leather and ink filling the room. "The embassy issued an official notice," he said. "Ryan's under investigation for misuse of pensioner funds. Lydia's name's on all the forged authorizations." I nodded slowly. "So he'll have to face the law too." Dawson's eyes softened. "They're more lenient when remorse shows early. He's got that, at least." After he left, I stood by the window watching Ryan in the garden. He was pruning George's roses, careful, deliberate, like he was afraid to harm them. His shoulders slumped with a weariness that went beyond travel. I stepped outside quietly. "You're doing it wrong," I said. He looked up, startled. "Sorry, Gran. I thought." I took the shears gently. "You cut at an angle. That way the wound drains." He watched me work, silent. Then he whispered, "Does everything have to pay for its mistakes?" I met his gaze. "Only if it wants to grow back stronger." The air smelled of cut stems and soil. For a long time, neither of us spoke. That evening, he left the shears by the door before coming inside. "Thank you," he said quietly. "For what?" "For letting me stay." I turned off the lamp. "I haven't decided if I have," I said, but my tone was softer than the words. When I looked back at the garden, the roses stood trimmed and upright, their wounds clean, their scent heavy in the night air. It felt like something new was beginning. Something smaller than forgiveness, but sturdier. The story made its way into the local paper. "Local couple's lavish honeymoon ends in fraud scandal." The headline was smaller now, tucked beneath sports scores and weather forecasts, but it was there. Mrs. Finch brought me a copy, pretending to come for tea. "You've seen this?" she asked, setting the paper down. "I have," I said. "Everyone's talking," she whispered. "Some say you were behind it all." I smiled faintly. "Then they finally credit me for something worth the gossip." She chuckled nervously, unsure if I was joking. That evening, I watched Ryan walk to the shop. Heads turned. Whispers followed him like shadows. I saw his posture shrink, his hands stuffed deep in his pockets. It reminded me of the little boy who once hid behind my skirt when scolded. When he came home, he sat at the table in silence. "They all know," he muttered. "Yes," I said. "And now you do too, what it feels like to be talked about instead of spoken to." He looked up, tears threatening. "You hate me, don't you?" I shook my head. "If I hated you, I'd have let you stay blind." That night, as the house grew quiet, I reread the article. The reporter had written one line that lingered, no comment from the victim, who remains dignified and silent. Dignified and silent. I folded the paper and tucked it into my ledger. Silence had been my weapon, now it was my shield. When I turned off the light, I whispered to George, "They finally see me, not as a victim, but as a reckoner." Days turned into weeks. The investigation concluded quietly. Lydia charged in absentia, Ryan cleared of intent but warned. Dawson stopped by with the legal papers confirming the funds were secured under my name. It's all yours again, he said. Not all, I corrected. Some lessons stay borrowed. He smiled. You'll never stop teaching, will you? I shrugged. Only the ones who still listen. Ryan began helping around the house without being asked. He repaired a leaking pipe, trimmed hedges, even painted the shed. The neighbors noticed. Slowly, whispers shifted, from scandal to sympathy. One afternoon, as I swept the porch, Mrs. Finch waved from across the street. He's working hard, that boy, she called. He's repaying debt, I answered. Ryan overheard and smiled faintly. Fair enough, he said. Later that evening, he came into the kitchen carrying a stack of mail. You've been invited to speak at the Women's Guild, he said. They want you to talk about financial safety for retirees. I laughed softly. From fraud victim to lecturer, how's that for irony? He grinned. Poetic, I'd say. That night, I stood at the window, the moon silver against the glass. Justice, I realized, wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about warning others before they fell into the same pit. Lydia had taken my money, but she had given me a cause. The reflection in the window looked older, yes, but steadier too. I whispered, balance restored. A week later, the phone rang again. It was Dawson, sounding pleased. Eleanor, your trust's been finalized. All assets are safe. I suggest we discuss what to do with the surplus. Surplus? I repeated. He chuckled. Interest accrued during the investigation. It's a small fortune. I smiled. Then it shouldn't stay idle. We met at his office that afternoon. The smell of parchment and polish filled the air. Together, we drafted the papers for a new fund, the More Trust, helping widows defrauded by family. When Ryan heard, his eyes widened. You're turning it into charity? I'm turning betrayal into purpose, I said. Money's meant to move. This time, it'll move in the right direction. He offered to design the logo, something simple, hopeful. I agreed. Watching him sketch, head bent, I saw the boy I'd raised return piece by piece. That night, we walked through the garden. Do you think she'll ever be caught? He asked quietly. Maybe, I said. But she's already lost the one thing she can't steal back, peace. We passed George's roses, blooming again. Ryan touched one carefully, avoiding the thorns. These survived, he said. So did we, I replied. For the first time, he smiled without shame. The morning air was crisp when I stepped onto the porch. Ryan was sitting there already, sipping tea and reading the paper. You're in it again, he said with a grin. I raised a brow. Am I scandalous this time? Hardly, he said, handing it over. The headline read, Elderly Widow Turns Betrayal into Blessing. I laughed softly. Now that's a headline worth framing. As I read, my heart felt lighter. It wasn't pride, it was closure. People would see not the theft, but the recovery. The article ended with a quote from me I didn't remember giving. Sometimes loss is the tuition fee for wisdom. Ryan smiled. You really said that? Something close to it, I said. We spent the afternoon in the garden, repainting the old fence. The scent of cut grass mixed with fresh paint. Birds hopped along the path, curious and unbothered. When the sun began to set, Ryan turned to me. Gran, he said quietly, thank you. For what? For destroying what I worshipped, money. You saved me by doing it. I met his eyes. You can rebuild anything, Ryan. Anything but trust twice. He nodded slowly. As the first stars appeared, I poured 2 cups of tea. The air smelled of earth and peace. I whispered to George's picture inside the window, the story's balanced now. For the first time, I believed it. Let's think through this step by step. Here are chapters 31 to 35, written in first-person past tense, exactly 350 words each, continuing the story faithfully from chapter 30, building tension toward moral redemption and poetic conclusion. The morning after the article, Ryan came into the kitchen early, his sleeves rolled up, eyes red but steady. Gran, he said, I want to make things right. Properly. I handed him a cup of tea. Start by telling the truth. All of it. He nodded. I told the police everything. How Lydia convinced me, how she forged your name, how I ignored the signs. He swallowed hard. They said I could have gone to jail if you'd pressed charges. I studied him quietly. And do you think I should have? He met my gaze. Maybe. I deserved it. I sighed. Punishment isn't the same as repayment. You still owe the latter. That afternoon, we went through my records together. He helped me sort receipts, donations, bank statements. Every number that once felt like grief now became a lesson. He wrote notes, asked questions, listened. When he grew tired, I showed him George's old tools. He built this house one beam at a time, I said. Now you'll help rebuild what trust you broke. Ryan nodded, shoulders squared. I'll do whatever it takes. Later that evening, we sat by the fire. The silence between us wasn't sharp anymore. It was heavy but healing. He looked up suddenly. Gran, why did you forgive me? I smiled faintly. I didn't. Not yet. But I remembered what it felt like to be loved when you didn't deserve it. That's where forgiveness begins. The kettle whistled softly, and for the first time, I saw in his eyes not the greedy man who betrayed me, but the child who'd once held my hand crossing the street. The gossip in town shifted again. People who once whispered now greeted me kindly at the market. Mrs. Finch stopped by with scones and an apology in her eyes. I never knew Eleanor, she said softly. You handled it with grace. I smiled. Grace is just patience that learned to speak softly. Ryan had started helping at the local community center, offering to teach budgeting classes to young couples. He used his own story as a warning. The first time I heard him speak, I stood quietly at the back. His voice trembled but never broke. Money's loud, he said to the crowd, but love should never shout through greed. Somewhere in that small room, George would have smiled. Afterward, he found me waiting by the door. You heard all that? I did, I said. You spoke truth. It's a fine start. The neighbors began to talk again, but this time, the tone had changed. Eleanor's forgiven him, they said. She's letting him work it off. One woman called it mercy. Another called it madness. I called it arithmetic. Every good deed pays down a fraction of the debt. That evening, over supper, Ryan looked up from his plate. Do you really think people can change? I met his eyes. People, no. Choices, yes. Change is just a collection of better choices. The next morning, he left early with his ledger under his arm. The boy who once stole my balance was now learning to balance himself. Forgiveness wasn't finished, but it had begun its installments. The More Trust opened its modest office 2 months later. A small brass plaque shone by the door, for those whose faith in family was misplaced, but whose hope still endures. I poured most of my recovered savings into it, with Dawson managing the legal side and Ryan assisting full-time. He helped design the logo, a rose sprouting from cracked stone. It was beautiful, simple, and honest. The first visitor came on a rainy afternoon. A widow from 2 towns over, trembling as she spoke about her son's borrowed investment. I held her hand and said softly, You'll recover more than money here. By evening, I watched Ryan talk her through forms, patient and kind. He didn't rush her or pity her. He listened. It struck me then how far he'd come. When he finished, he looked up and smiled faintly. Feels good, he said. Helping always does, I replied. The local paper ran another small article. More Trust helps victims of family fraud. This time, my name appeared beside Ryan's. It suits us both, I said when I saw it. That night, I lit a candle by George's photograph. We're still building, love, I whispered. Just different walls now. Outside, rain tapped gently against the window panes like quiet applause. For the first time since my savings vanished, I didn't feel the pull of bitterness. Instead, I felt gratitude, that the money which once caused ruin now funded repair. Justice, I thought, was never meant to destroy. It was meant to redirect. One morning, A plain envelope arrived without a return address. I knew before opening it. Inside lay Lydia's court summons: fraud, forgery, and theft. The hearing date circled in red. Ryan froze when he saw it. "Are you going?" he asked quietly. I stared at the paper, feeling no triumph. "No," I said. "Let the law handle what conscience couldn't." He hesitated. "You're not angry?" I was, I admitted. But anger's like debt, it compounds if you don't let it go. That evening, I built a small fire in the hearth. The summons sat on the table, edges curling from the heat. I watched the flames flicker, steady and orange. Ryan stood beside me. "You're burning it?" "Yes," I said softly. "The story's already written. I don't need the paperwork to prove it." As the edges blackened, I whispered, "Goodbye, Lydia." The paper folded in on itself and vanished into ash. Ryan reached for my hand, tentative. I let him hold it. The warmth from the fire reached our fingers, not fierce, just real. Afterward, we sat in silence, watching the last sparks fade. The air smelled faintly of smoke and closure. Sometimes the cleanest justice isn't served in court, I thought. It's served in peace. A month later, Ryan found an old letter in a storage box at the trust office. He brought it home, eyes somber. "It's from Lydia," he said quietly. The envelope was yellowed, postmarked weeks before she disappeared. Inside, a single sheet read, "Greed taught me everything love never could. I'm sorry you learned it through me." Ryan's hands shook as he handed it to me. She blamed herself in the end. I read the words twice, then folded the paper neatly. "She learned greed from someone too," I said. He frowned. "Who?" I looked at him gently. "The world. It rewards the wrong things too easily." We placed the letter in the trust's archive, proof not of tragedy, but of transformation. That evening, Ryan stayed late at the office, helping a new widow fill forms. When he returned, his hands were ink-stained, his voice calm. "I think I finally understand, Gran," he said. "What's that?" "That fixing things feels better than taking them." I smiled. "Then you've paid your first real installment." Later, I walked through the quiet garden. The roses bloomed again, fuller than ever. I whispered, "George, even thorns can grow beauty if tended right." The moon hung low, lighting the path back to the house. Justice had come, forgiveness was unfolding, and the silence finally sounded like peace. The morning of the award ceremony dawned bright and clear, like the world had finally exhaled. The Moore Trust had helped 15 families by then, and Dawson insisted I attend the event where we'd receive national recognition. "You deserve this," he said. "It's not every day revenge turns into relief." Ryan drove us into the city. He wore a simple suit, hair neat, posture straight. I watched him as we crossed the bridge. He'd grown quieter, humbler, but stronger too. The hall shimmered with lights and cameras. When they called my name, I walked slowly to the stage, applause washing over me like a tide I hadn't expected. The host smiled warmly. "Mrs. Moore," she said, "what inspired your foundation?" I looked at the rows of faces, some curious, some tearful. "Absence," I said simply. "When people you love disappear with your trust, you learn the weight of what's missing. The best way to heal it is by giving presence to others." The room was silent for a breath, then applause filled it. Ryan stood in the front row, clapping with his head bowed. I saw tears glint in his eyes. After the ceremony, a reporter asked if I'd forgiven those who wronged me. I smiled. Forgiveness isn't about forgetting what happened. It's about remembering without bleeding. That evening, I placed the glass award on the mantel beside George's picture. The firelight danced across both. "We did it, love," I whispered. "We turned their theft into legacy." Outside, wind rustled through the roses. Justice had long since been served. What remained now was gratitude, the quiet kind that grows like roots. Months later, I received a call I hadn't expected. Ryan's voice was steady, but low. "Gran, it's Lydia," he said. Her business collapsed. She reached out. I froze. "And what did she want?" "A job," he said. At the trust. For a long moment, I said nothing. The absurdity almost made me laugh. The thief wants to work in the house she tried to rob. He hesitated. She's broke. She sounded different. Guilt changes tone, I said. Not melody. Still, I felt a strange calm. Offer her a position, I said finally. Receptionist. His silence spoke disbelief. You're serious? Let her sit where honesty lives. She'll either suffocate or learn to breathe. Weeks later, I met her in person. She looked older, thinner, her confidence cracked. When our eyes met, she whispered, I never meant to hurt you. I nodded. Intentions are cheaper than apologies. For months, she worked quietly. No schemes, no tricks. Just humility. Ryan supervised her, cautious but kind. One afternoon, she left a note on my desk. I'm learning what earning feels like. I folded it and smiled faintly. Some debts could never be repaid, but acknowledgement was its own currency. That evening, I whispered to George's photo, even weeds can bloom if planted in the right soil. The trust thrived. We expanded into 3 towns, helping women rebuild stolen lives. Ryan became a counselor, Lydia remained as clerk, and I handled correspondence from my small office overlooking the garden. One day, Dawson arrived with papers. You've done enough work, Eleanor. Let others carry it now. I laughed softly. You mean retire? You've earned it twice over, he said. That evening, I walked through the garden. The air smelled of rain and rose petals. I thought about George, about all the numbers that once defined my life. Pounds, dates, betrayals. Now they were stories told by people we'd helped. Later, I visited my old house, the one Lydia once tried to take. It had been sitting empty since the trial. I paid to have it repaired, painted, renewed. When it was ready, I left the new keys in Lydia's mailbox. A note accompanied them. Some invitations don't need words. When she called crying, I simply said, make it a home this time. The silence that followed was the purest peace I'd ever felt. That night, as I locked my own door, I whispered to George, we've rebuilt more than money, haven't we? 2 years later, Ryan invited me to a small graduation ceremony for students sponsored by our trust. The hall buzzed with laughter and bright futures. Parents hugged their children, photos flashed, hope filled the air. I sat near the back, content just to watch. Ryan gave a speech, clear, steady, heartfelt. We all fall, he said, but what defines us is who helps us stand again. When the applause began, I noticed Lydia in the crowd, sitting quietly among other staff. She looked lighter somehow, her eyes no longer sharp with greed but soft with understanding. Afterward, she approached me. You came, she said softly. I don't attend many ceremonies, I replied. But some endings deserve witnesses. We stood in silence, the past hanging between us like an old curtain that no longer mattered. Across the hall, Ryan waved from the stage, smiling proudly. Gran, he called. We did it. I nodded, my throat tight. Yes, dear, I whispered. You finally learned what building means. As I left the hall, I felt no bitterness, no triumph, only balance. Some stories don't end with punishment. They end with proportion. That evening, I returned home and sat by the window as the sun dipped low behind George's roses. The garden glowed gold, every petal catching light like forgiveness itself. I held my teacup close and thought of everything. The empty bank book, the signatures, the fire, the faces. All the pain had been accounted for, every wound reconciled. Ryan visited later with flowers. For you, he said. From the trust. I smiled. You've learned where true interest lies. He grinned. Compound compassion, you once called it. We laughed quietly, and for once, laughter didn't echo, it settled. After he left, I walked into the garden. The air hummed softly with life. I traced one rosebud with my finger and whispered to George's memory, they stole my savings, but I invested in wisdom. The wind stirred gently, as if in reply. I turned back toward the house, its windows glowing in twilight. The plaque above my fireplace read, Let honesty be the only inheritance you spend. Looking out at the fading light, I smiled. If love costs integrity, I murmured, the bill always comes due. Please subscribe, like and share for more, thanks.